It all stems from that moment when you're a single contributor and suddenly somebody uplifts you into management with no training. So you're suddenly in a very different world. What was the first thing I did? I thought, okay, great. I feel honored, but I feel a lot of pressure, right? I feel I have to prove something. Where was the last guy's sales plan? That would be a great thing to find, to understand what they were charting towards. And of course, I would say maybe even 10 times out of 10 times, but 9 times out of 10 times, you're not going to find it because nothing was really articulated.
In a corporate world where all employees have great leaders with no egos that create fun cultures where people can do their best work, the employees and companies thrive while doing great things for the customers, themselves, and each other.
Well, we know that rarely happens. I'm Jeff Palacio. I have been a leader for over 40 years for every t-shirt size company, from small 16 employees to extra large over 1 million. Please join me while I interview outstanding leaders that will share stories of great leadership and not so great. It will help you become a better leader while poking fun at all the crazy shit that happens in corporate America.
Hi, I'm Joe Deshawn, and welcome to the Corporate Couch with Jeff Palacio. Today's episode is brought to you by Palacio and Partners, providing turnkey podcast creation, hosting, production, promotion, and related creative resources for you and your business. Today, Jeff is interviewing Rich Cogswell. Rich is the Vice President of Business Development at EMEA, a global leader in real-time cross-border payments. Prior to working at EMEA, Richard held multiple senior sales leadership positions within a number of industries, including everything from startups to multinational companies. He is the best-selling author of The Cultural Sales Leader: Sustaining People, Attaining Results, a practical guide using a layered approach to becoming an expert in business. You can learn more about Rich at richardcogswell.com. Let's listen as Jeff talks to Rich.
Rich, welcome to the Corporate Couch today.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here.
So honored to have you on the podcast. So we're recording here at 9 a.m. Central Time, U.S., and you are our first international guest. You're in Singapore, so it's 11 p.m. In Singapore time. So thank you. And you're also our first FinTech expert to come on the podcast. So double honor, and very excited to talk about your career as well as your book that was published in June of 2024, The Cultural Sales Leader. So yeah, we're going to have some fun, and
fantastic.
You have a great accent too. So you're like the triple threat, Rich.
Wow. Well, what an intro. It can only go downhill from there. But I really appreciate it. And hey, I'm honored to stand up for FinTech and obviously representing. Well, I'm from the UK, but representing where I'm living at the moment in Singapore. Yeah.
Yeah, you've lived in Singapore like 12 years. Is that right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
It's one of those places where, time goes. It's incredible, and that's a very common experience. It can be quite a transient place. People get posted here for maybe a year, 2 years, but then there's a whole set of others, for whom they arrive and literally 5 years, 10 years disappears in a flash. It's quite an amazing place in that sense.
Yeah, exciting. And I like that you said posted in Singapore. So, that's not a common U.S. term. So I love that. Well, let's talk about even people that know you fairly well, Rich. What one thing would surprise them about you?
Well, I guess the thing that I'm constantly trying to surprise people with being here is that I'm actually third generation of the male side of my family to be in Singapore, albeit not through luck or planning and not through having been born here either. So that's, this is a journey that has gone from sort of Second World War to, the war that came very soon after that in Malaya, And then basically my wars are just corporate corporate wars. But yeah, my grandfather was here with a rubber business. He had a whole factory, rubber being sourced down from Malaya, and he was here when the Japanese invaded. He sent my father and his then wife on one of the last troop ships that left here. To basically that went to Australia and then back to the UK. So he didn't know if they got out okay or not. And he actually had a letter from Dunlop, which is the company he was working for, telling him to go to South America to source rubber for the war effort there. But he decided to try and defend the place and got wrapped up on the Burma Railway, survived that. That was a very brutal experience. Came back after the war, found his ex-employees, set up the business again. And then my father was garrisoned here with the British Army. And then the British had a jungle war from around about, I think it was 49 to 56 in Malaya, which triggered independence, which then triggered Singaporean independence. And then I'm just purely by chance, I followed a customer essentially to find my spot here. But when I had the opportunity, I jumped at it. So
Wow.
that perhaps is the hidden history.
No, wow, amazing. So, did you ever visit Singapore, like in your
No,
childhood?
never,
Yeah.
never. Well,
Wow.
I tell a lie. I mean, in the sense that so my path. I mean, I was selling electronic invoicing services, e-billing services in Europe, and happened to white label, well, do a deal with a part of DHL, and we white labeled it for DHL Express. So we had an e-billing solution going country by country in Europe, which was for them, but then I was doing deals for their customers on the white labeled service, and they started asking me to come out here. So that was the first time I really experienced Asia. So for about 3 years, I was doing these road trips where basically I'd do a sort of e-billing educational workshop, and I was doing it Singapore, Shanghai, Hong Kong. And that eventually turned into a job offer to come here in a totally different industry.
Yeah. Uh, that's incredible, incredible. I love that. Where did you grow up, and what did you love doing as a kid? Talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I might have been a Texan. I was basically born in London W1, but my father had left the army at this point and had just got well, he had a role at IBM. He had become a very successful salesperson in London for them, and they asked him to go out to Austin, Texas, and apparently I was quite imminent. So I was either going to be born in Austin or in London, and they decided to hold back. Hence, I have a British accent today. And could have been a very different history, I guess, otherwise. So the
Yeah.
first 3, 4 years of my life, I was based in the States, and apparently had a US accent till I was about 7.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Interesting.
but but we did come back to the UK. We moved around quite a bit. What did I love doing? I've always been quite sporty, just naturally interested in sport, love sport. Uh, Really picked up cricket very, very early, and that was a passion. I played at quite a high level, and then always into football. If you asked me what I wanted to be, it would have been a footballer or a spy, James Bond or a footballer probably.
Yeah.
Um,
So
and
martinis shaken or stirred for you,
well,
Rich?
I didn't get into those until later in life, obviously. You know? And then picked up a bit of rugby through sort of later school and university. So I always really enjoyed sport, and I suppose I've grown up a healthy competitive spirit through all of that as well.
Yeah, I love that. You go to Wellington College. What was your initial major, and was that your final major? And why'd you pick that major or majors?
Yeah, so I guess major is that's more university. So Wellington was sort of the years of 13 to 18
Oh, okay.
pre-university. So I was doing what still are, I think, and I think the terminology's changed, but it was O levels and A levels. So, I had 10 subjects around O level. That was sort of 13 to 16, and then 16 to 18, it was A level. So that goes down to four. So I did history, English, art, and politics. and then took a year out, traveled, and then went to university, where I think that's where you sort of really start to focus,
Okay.
right? So I took on history because, I was the first to go to university in my family. I wasn't getting a lot of direction there because, there was no one to really talk to about whether this was the right move. What did you do? It just seemed like a path I thought I was supposed to take. And obviously my parents were very proud that I was going down that road. So I just took what I was good at, which was my best subject, which was history.
Yeah, love that. So you have a history major. You graduate from I think it was the University of Glasgow, right? And so,
Correct.
what
Yeah.
was your first job out of college, and how'd you get it, or
Well,
university?
believe it or not, it was commission only sort of insurance and financial sales. So probably the hardest, or at least, baptism of fire from a sales perspective, right? But the reason why I went down that road was, out of uni, there were a lot of these sort of scheduled experiences where you would have a corporate, a massive corporate like a Esso, or one of these global companies would come in and they would pick through interview maybe 20 candidates who would go forward to a series of workshops and managerial tests and numbers of interviews. And I did this with maybe four or five. And basically the end result of these was that they were only picking maybe four candidates out of 20, right? So it was a pathway to some very interesting companies, but I didn't really see how I could break through. I thought, of course you have to be talented, but I thought there'll be a huge element of luck as well, right? Because these are
Right.
very intense sort of 2-day affairs, and you have to be on point for every single time you're in front of someone. So I was getting a little bit frustrated, and I was I guess I was in a bit of a rush in those days. I wanted to be earning, I wanted to have some independence, I
Yeah,
wanted to
like
get
most
away,
people in their 20s, right?
yeah, from home and so forth. So I saw this thing, this advert, and I don't know if you've seen the film Boiler Room.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up because I know you mentioned it in your book with
I did. I mentioned
yeah.
it
So I
because I literally lived the scene from that, where not too dissimilar, except that was a pretty dodgy sort of share trading environment, which I think it was based on fact, that film. But there's a scene where you've got, these potential workers, and all young men basically. And then this very flash guy in a beautiful suit walks into the room and tosses his Ferrari keys on the table, and it's basically who wants to make money, right? And I had a very similar interview experience going into this commission only environment, and it was, in many ways, I'm so happy I did it because in many ways, it set me up in opposition to many of the things I witnessed, right? It was an incredibly aggressive environment. I'm not against cold calling at all, but basically the rule was you were standing cold calling unless you had a client. That was when you could sit, right? And in that environment, your client was coming to a very aggressive environment, right? 90% male, all, aggressively on the phone. And then it was set up in this way that I would have the big chair, you would have a tiny chair, and then I would basically be tutored in a way to close you on a price, largely through guilting you into not having life assurance or not having a pension, right? And
right.
and sort of knowing enough about you to push some triggers around family, what happens to you if you're not around, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you basically ate if you sold something, right? So as I say, a baptism of fire. But I think I'd learnt a huge amount around what I perceived were not ways to do business, right?
Right.
And not ways to manage people.
Yeah.
I think these sort of businesses have died out a little bit, or I like to hope they have. Maybe there are a few still around, but that it was a particular type of animal.
I think when you sell for 100% commission, it really, it teaches you something. And I have not met one salesperson that likes cold calling. I don't care if
Mm.
you're, 1 year out of college or 30 years in sales. No one likes it, but I think it gets you out of your comfort level.
Oh,
and you
100%.
and you have
Yeah.
to learn how to build relationships. And when you're doing the smile and dialing, it's the repetition, right? So
Yeah.
I do think it builds great foundational things. Now it's another thing to emulate the boiler room, you know, environment, but you know,
Yeah.
as long as it's ethical, yeah,
Well, I think this is where the line gets a little blurry. But to your point, I think that look, it's not all negative. You definitely learn. I think sales is largely about rejection, isn't it? And it's about being, um, I suppose, motivated enough that you keep going, right? There's that anecdote that most salespeople give up after three attempts at a client,
right,
but it's those who are consistently there adding value,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And that's where I deviate a little bit from that experience because the value proposition, it was very aggressive, right? And you're guilting people into purchases as
yeah,
opposed to um, having a genuine value proposition because you're illustrating something that somebody perhaps doesn't at the moment realize they need, but through the course of a relationship will.
yeah,
So, so definitely not all negative. You're
yeah,
right, and it certainly teaches you also to be creative. And I think again, something that any good salesperson needs to have is some degree of being able to create a plan,
yeah,
right? Because again, if you're told to open up a book and cold call, that to me is the greatest example of a sort of shotgun approach to selling, where you're just
right,
shooting for anything, see what lands, as opposed to maybe narrowing that dimension of focus
hmm,
to be a little more productive, right?
right, yeah. So, history major to getting going your first job into sales, was that
Yeah,
your dad's influence? Because obviously he was pretty leading edge, legendary. I mean, if he was doing this,
yeah,
in London for IBM, like IBM was a legendary sales
yeah,
company.
yeah. Look, he was a huge influence on my life. I mean, soldier first, so, and a fighting infantryman at that, a
Wow.
platoon commander in the jungle. Um, Incredible stories from that, but obviously that was a very strong personality. And then you're right, getting into IBM, which at the time and for a long time, even I at the beginning of my career, once I'd moved on, went through an IBM sales training, right?
Wow.
It would seem to be the pinnacle.
Yeah.
What I think now, since we've got through, solution sales, challenger sales, and other types of models, it's very kind of feature benefit. Find the objection, get on a loop to close it down.
Right.
Can I have the business now? Kind of, it was one of those, repetitive
Uh-huh.
types of processes, very,
Yep.
very sort of aligned to, I suppose, having a typewriter or a display writer, a computer, which was ultimately what he was selling. He was selling
Right.
hardware in those
Right.
days, right?
Yeah.
And again, he had a very tough start to his career in London, where he literally had a geographic part of London. He had to knock on doors. He got thrown out of many buildings, and
Wow.
and he would have five, well, whatever it is, 20 seconds to make a pitch to get someone a photocopier or something, right?
Wow.
So again, we had something in common there. So absolutely, I think, and I also saw from him, even from a young age, he was traveling, he was wearing suits and things, and it just struck me as, okay, I can see the lifestyle you're able, even from a young age, you can get a sense of it, right?
Sure.
And I had the sense, it's a people business. I wanted, I have a love for people. I'd always been fascinated in terms of, how you can work with and better with people. So I think that's what ultimately drew me to it, as opposed to any other type of career.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about fintech, because I mean,
Yeah,
explain it in terms of what is it? Because I don't think everybody really understands, and what is the
sure.
most common misperception about what it is?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, fintech, it's, I guess, insurtech, fintech, martech, this has all happened over the course of maybe the last 10 or 20 years where you get these industries that have a tech component added onto them, right? I mean, not long after the experience in the so-called boiler room, I had a very short stint on a graduate program with Barclays that I didn't like it. I did find myself in the payments industry, right? Now, I think a lot of elements of the payment industry have morphed into what you would now call fintech, right? And I suppose what this is about is, having technology that's the driving force behind creating a solution that happens to be a payment solution, essentially. Or, because if you look at the company that I'm in currently, what I do is card issuing. So basically, but credit card, but virtual credit cards. I do that in a B2B context. But the whole premise of the company that I work in has been built up around the frictions of moving money, firstly for individuals, and secondly, for companies. And this is a lot of this is in opposition to a banking system that has very legacy systems, that has a convoluted way of submitting money around the world, a slow way of submitting money around the world. The tech element of this is bringing technology to do things quicker, faster, cheaper, or to bring some form of efficiency to a process, right? So, back when I was doing payment solutions around the UK automated clearinghouse, no one was calling it fintech in those days. And
Right.
as I graduated into electronic invoicing and e-billing, which is a genuine sort of consultancy sale, because what you're doing is you're taking a heavy paper inefficient process. Accounts payable is a cost center and inefficiency, right? Where
Right.
people sort of find their solutions around how they fix certain problems. But you're basically, number one, coming in to consult on that, to understand how big the problem is and to put a number against some of these. You're then trying to show some value in terms of how you can create a stickier supply chain relationship, perhaps some value on both ends of that. And your solution is technology, right? So I think, increasingly that morphing of those three things is what you might call fintech. So the way I think about my career, for the most part, so about 85% of my career has been what I would call payments related.
Hmm.
I see myself as being at the nexus of payments, technology, and data, right? And I think if you have those elements, and it could be the same in insurtech, it could be the same in martech, right? Then that's where these modern terminologies around,
Right.
throwing the tech on the end of come in. It's basically a solution sale at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, yeah, thank you for that. That's a great explanation. What do you think in terms of, yeah, and specifically for fintech, but all these, and I'm not going to say it's new technologies, obviously, because there are, but AI, blockchain,
Yeah.
Web3. What do you see there in terms of how it's going to change the current fintech industry?
Yeah, do you know, so it's interesting. I did I was at Money 2020 and another show this year where I was basically on stage with the subject of innovations within payments, right? I was sharing the stage with someone, and as we were preparing for this, I said to my colleague, I think the first thing we've got to do is define what part of the ecosystem we're in, because, you know, the payments ecosystem is large, and it's dealing with consumers and it's dealing with businesses, right? Not all of those things that you've mentioned are relevant to my space, but they're certainly relevant to payments, right?
Right.
So you talk about Web3, elements of crypto. That to me is kind of driving towards a consumer environment, right?
Mhm.
Where you've got newer technologies coming because of frictions within consumer experiences, right? Whether it's and I guess that's the promise of crypto, but it hasn't quite manifested itself into daily usable use cases, I would argue, right?
Right.
Blockchain, on the other hand, which is an offshoot of all of that, is something that you're finding in very mainstream processes, because at the end of the day, it's a ledger, right? And it's an
Right.
incredible ledger technology. So, I even talk with MasterCard. If you combine, blockchain ledger to a credit card payment, and a virtual credit card payment, you can basically have a single use card for a single payment. So you have extreme reconciliation. And if you added that to, an example might be, you're sourcing Wagyu from Japan and you're bringing it into the US into a restaurant, and you want to know the genesis of that animal. You want to know how it was fed, how it was slaughtered, how it's had made its journey to you, the customs and duty payments that have got to you, and ultimately your purchase and supply payments as well. That could all be on one ledger, right?
Right.
And then, interrogated by any element that needs to reconcile or show something for an audit or whatever it might be. And then you get things like payment orchestration, which is basically, you've got a website, you don't want your customer to leave that website to go to a payments environment. You want them to be able to pay in whatever way is easy for them. So you want to support as much as you can. So you get these technologies that basically solve for that. And then there's my part of the world, which is, solving for frictions in supply chain, basically, in terms of B2B, where, AI to me doesn't quite sit within that, but it could sit on the buyer side,
Hmm.
where, you could have a global company that has many suppliers, some of them very large, some can acquire a credit card, some can't, some want immediate payment, some want slower payment. You have attributes around the payments as well. Do you need to earn a rebate? Can you hold back? Is FX the issue? Is it speed or cost? AI can help there, because you can basically take that whole accounts payable book and switch it to however many suppliers you have, from your banking partners to your
Right.
fintechs to what
Yeah.
have you. So I guess what all of this is basically saying is it's an incredibly rich environment, right? And there are innovations that have been around for a long time. There are newer innovations, but it's all driving towards efficiencies and scalability, and trying to help customers. I mean, customers, we still can't solve for one supplier meets all type of environments, right? Especially for customers who work on a global basis. But
Yeah.
you can solve for value, efficiency, speed, and reconciliation, right?
Right.
And elements of these are coming to solve for that for sure.
So, I mean, you worked at startups and
Yeah,
bigger companies. Like, what
yeah,
were some of the examples for you of great company cultures and or sales cultures? Because you obviously
sure.
spent your career there.
Yeah. Well, I have to reflect this in the way that I tried to write the book, actually. What I found is that I was at various stages of my sales leadership career, right? And I was looking for resources that I couldn't really find. And it all stems from that moment when you're a single contributor and suddenly somebody uplifts you into management with no training, right?
Right.
So you're suddenly in a very different world. And what was the first thing I did? I thought, okay, great. I feel honored, but I feel a lot of pressure, right? I feel I have to prove something. Where was the last guy's sales plan? That would be a great thing to find, to understand what they were charting towards. And of course, I would say maybe even 10 times out of 10 times, but 9 times out of 10 times, you're not going to find it, because nothing was really articulated. So what you can then find, and what I've witnessed in a lot of environments, and I was the same, what do you then fall back on? You fall back on what you think you're good at, right? Because you're a little bit frightened about what you don't know. Um, and you probably don't really change very much. So you're probably living financial year to financial year prior to your appointment, and most likely afterwards as well, right? And then if things go well, then you start to develop things. It took me a year and a half to even ask for investment in myself, right?
Yeah.
In any training, because I felt I had to earn my spurs, so to speak. So culture is an interesting one, because I think at that stage of things, you're not really so conscious of culture. other than maybe that, again, a sales team to me is a very interesting animal, because I used to think of sales teams. I'll go to cricket, right? So not for everybody, I know, but perhaps the analogy holds true. I played in a lot of teams where you've got a lot of very talented individuals somehow melded together, and there's a lot of specialism within cricket. But the team sometimes feels as if it's fighting a lot internally, right? You're all going towards a single goal, absolutely, but there's a lot of tension within that quite often. And I would often think, we have two batsmen from the opposing side who come into this environment where there's a lot of banter and friction between the players who are ultimately there combined to beat you, right?
Right.
And I often thought that a little bit about a sales team, you know. So I think that's where you start to think about culture, because but then it's coming from what you're used to. And I think the danger of what happens in majority of places where people are promoted with no training, and where, sales isn't taught at schools, right, for a start, and then leadership tends to be experienced and learnt as opposed to taught before people get it. The danger is you just kind of replicate what you're used to,
Right.
right? Right.
Yeah.
So my perspective on culture has been, I think, inevitably over the journey, right? So I can look back now and I can recognize, oh my God, that was amazing. That was an amazing culture. Um, and I've just come to the point now where my thesis is, most companies, I mean, you just look back at companies you've worked for. How many were, you know, truly fusing the people to the mission,
Right.
right? And within that, articulating a very a simple go-to-market that has good planning underneath it, but then that brings all departments along on that journey, right? How many companies you've been at where sales is at odds with marketing? Sales is at odds with, the operational side, the onboarding, the compliance, whatever it might be. They're fighting because you guys are not helping us do the deal, right? You're throwing obstacles in our way,
Right.
as opposed to everyone being a kind of unit going forward because everyone understands each other's focuses, right? Which
Right.
isn't to say that there aren't problems, but
Yeah.
you work better together to solve for them. And I also, I think over the journey have found there's a lot of misunderstanding about what culture means, It can come across sometimes as a kind of airy fairy nice thing, right? Everyone gets along, blah blah, whatever. And I'm again in opposition to that, because it just so happens that one of the most culturally adapted and sort of focused companies I ever worked for also happen to be in the most aggressive in the marketplace. So none of this is to discount aggression in the marketplace, ambition, you
Right.
know. I think you can be insanely ambitious and have a great culture. And if you do combine those two, then you've already got something over your competition.
Yeah.
But it is fragile.
Are you drowning in boring corporate communications? Palacio and Partners is here to rescue you. We transform internal podcasts from snooze fest to must-listen content that actually connects your team and strengthens your culture. Imagine podcast episodes that make your employees laugh while staying informed. Our founder, Jeff Palacio, doesn't just create podcasts, he creates conversations that break through the noise. Whether you're a growing startup or a massive corporation, we turn your company's story into audio gold. Leadership becomes human. Remote teams feel connected. Your message cuts through the clutter. Palacio and Partners, where corporate communications gets a fun makeover. Let's make your podcast work harder than your email inbox ever could. Jeff is happy to share his insights on podcasting with you. You can contact him via LinkedIn or schedule a Zoom call via the link in the episode description.
Yeah, I think that type of kind of controlled ambition or whatever it's kind of analogous to Tom Collins, and I think it's Good to Great, where he talks about level 1 to 5 leadership, and level 5 is you're very ambitious, but not for yourself. it's
Mm.
for the good of the mission, right? So I think,
Right.
yeah.
So
So
I came across someone who said something incredible, who basically said all leaders should be working to make themselves redundant.
right,
Now that's a very emotive,
yeah,
no one wants to be redundant, right?
sure,
But what he's actually saying there, and this is what I think good culture enables you to do, and this is what I'm trying to chart out in my book as well, is let's go back to that first promotion, or maybe you've got a few miles under your belt and you're asked to come and turn around a company, or you move to your next company. It's so easy to get sucked into the trenches all the time, right? Constant escalations. All you're doing is you're driving things, you're asking people for their commitment, but you're also in the trenches trying to fix things, which doesn't allow you to lift your head at all and look at what a 3 to 5 year horizon might be. What are the rocket fuels that can really change your business if you had investment? And it doesn't allow you either to be able to go and ask for that investment, because you can't necessarily articulate what a new product will give you from the ground up on the market, what the customers are saying, what a new market entry would look like either. And the whole premise of fusing these things together like this is to ensure that everybody in the business knows what the primary focuses are, and they're building their focuses up to meet that, right? And I think the more that you do that, even functions that don't necessarily typically work to understand what the business is trying to do, and I don't mean anything when I say this, but like an HR generalist, you could ask them, well, what are the dynamics of what we do in the market? And I think many might not give you an answer, but in
right,
that kind of environment where you are fusing everybody to the mission, they're as conscious what the business is trying to achieve. Therefore, what they're trying to achieve is tied into that, and they can explain it in
right,
in in a typical elevator pitch if you were to ask them, because it's something that is laid out. Of course it's adapted, but it's repeated. It's said at the beginning of every, we look back at what we've been trying to achieve at the beginning of every meeting, town hall, whatever it is, right? And
right,
offsites and so forth. So it's got that sort of reinforceability
yeah.
about it.
Yeah, like yeah, every level of the organization should know what the mission is, right, and be able to
Right.
articulate it. So I love that. I want to go back because you've mentioned it several times, and I totally agree. But like the newly promoted,
Yeah.
manager, from individual contributor, it's amazing to me the number of companies that don't do anything to train them. And I
No,
think
yeah,
especially
absolutely.
in sales, I think because you're going to fall back, and I think you referred to it earlier, you're going to fall back on what you do best. And here's the problem: like you're you, and the 10 people you're leading are not you. So
Yeah.
they're going to have their own ways, and you can't force them to be like you because they're not.
Yeah.
But that's what you do because that's how made you successful and got you promoted, right?
Absolutely. And I think that the issue there is you've got to, there's two things, right? You've got across the board, you've got a very different set of relationships suddenly, right? Before you're, as a single contributor, you're the master of your own little business,
Yeah,
essentially.
yeah,
But suddenly you've got to change relationship with your management, right? You've got to change relationship with your peers, you know, and then you've got all those supporting functions as well, right?
right,
And I think the danger then is that you can become very conscious of what you don't know as opposed to what you do know as
right,
well.
yeah,
And then you can also be reticent to ask for help, which was as I was,
yeah,
right? And I think that then becomes, it can become further hard-lined, because what happened to me was, again, a few years under my belt, I then get approached to turn around a situation that's not necessarily functioning. You might be in the same industry, but you're in a different company, so the language is already different, right? The products are different, right? The
hmm,
personalities might be, of course, different, but that can put you under more pressure, right? Because suddenly everyone's looking at you because they expect you to have the solutions, and you can rush to that, or just rush getting busy, as opposed to, you know, having a sense at that point, well, this is the beginning of my structural philosophy of how I go about things, and I don't need to have the answer straight away today. I need to do some detective work on the environment that I'm in to understand where we need to focus and what have you, right?
Right.
Um, but without being given any learning or teaching or mentorship on that journey, as you say, you fall back on what you know, right? And that can just hardline behaviors, because to
Hmm.
my mind, behaviors create culture that lead to results.
Right.
That can be good, that can be bad, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Your culture is going to be, a friend of mine, Jonathan Jones, who's been on the podcast, he said your culture is like your lawn. If you're intent on making it a great lawn, you have a
Yeah,
great, you have a great lawn or a great culture. And if you do nothing to
yeah.
it, you still have a lawn. It's going to look
So
shitty, but
I think that's an amazing analogy, because I have a quote, and again, this will turn some off maybe, but I have a quote from Arsene Wenger, because I'm British, I'm a football fan. He was the most successful manager of Arsenal Football Club, right?
okay.
So that's where people are turning off
Yeah.
right now. But if they hold on for a second, he was also very, they called him the professor because he was quite philosophical about the sport. He said, culture is like a flower, you know, if you tend to it, it will grow, and if you neglect it, it will die. And it's a very simple thought, right?
Yeah.
So, but what it's saying, and what you're saying, what your friend there is saying, is that it's ultimately fragile, and if you don't jealously guard it or maintain it or feed it or mow it,
Right.
you're just one headhunter acquisition merger away from someone else's turnaround story,
Yeah. Yeah.
essentially, right?
100%. Yeah.
So I think, and look, inevitably we see it in our sports teams. They rise and fall, and often it's because of cultural issues. A
Sure.
star player that can't be accommodated into
Yeah.
the team, you let that person go, and the whole tide rises, right?
Yeah.
You see that all the time, and unfortunately, you know, it even happened to that company I mentioned, which was the most culturally aligned. The CEO had mentorship baked into their DNA. Therefore, everyone from director level and above was trained to have a coaching mentality as well, right? So coaching and mentoring was a big part of that
Sure.
business. Insanely ambitious, right? Really thought in terms of 3 to 5 year horizons, really thought in terms of how to dominate the markets they were in,
Yeah.
and would execute on that and celebrate that.
Yeah.
But they had and it's a COVID story, but they had a merger, which because of COVID was a normal takeover, um, kind of got pulled back, and ultimately the acquired took over that business, but a very, clashing culture to the original company.
Right.
So now suddenly, whatever it is, probably 4 years later, they're resurrecting elements of their original culture,
Right.
right? So there can be environments where this inevitably does not get held on to, you know,
Right.
but if you can fuse it, that's where, I think those are both the environments that you look back on with the most fondness, because you had the best time and it was fun.
Yep.
Um, and they're also the ones where you probably accomplish the most, I would say.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to help others to hopefully find and
Yeah.
bring into their businesses.
And I think a lot of companies are like this. So the sales team is a lot of times disliked, and there's a bias
Mm,
against them from other functional areas like HR, accounting, finance, IT,
yeah,
because they say, "Oh, look how much the salespeople make." And so they're kind of like
yeah,
prejudiced, but it's like, yeah, you need to understand that like these people are bringing in the money to support us. So I don't know, how do
yeah,
if you go into an environment like that as a
yeah,
sales leader, how do you get the cross-functional teams to like embrace sales and support them,
yeah.
right? Because that's what the culture should be, right?
Yeah. So this to me, this comes back down to leadership, right? And a philosophy of leadership, because I think too often as well, you can think of leadership in terms of your function, right? And I think there's a care of duty to go a little bit further, which is not to say you're dominating leadership on others. No, it's about communication, right? So this is where I've come up with a tool which I have as a template within the book, which I call the cornerstone, right? Which is basically a one pager, right? So the business may have a one pager, right? Which is front and center. What are the financials? What are we shooting for, right? And it should be around this year. There may be a vision of a little bit further, but it's singular. And then you can have the behaviors and values that are driving that, and then your key focuses. This is absolutely what I'm here to lay down to achieve that. Maybe it has what you need to win in there as well, right? So some elements of articulating your major challenges, and then the focuses of you, the leader. So much the better if the business has that, right? Because that's where you start building that vision that you can marry everyone to. But then, to my mind, as a commercial leader, you got to have that as well, right? What underpins it is your sales plan, right? But you've got to have that. And it's that I would be taking to other departments, other functions. And before I published it or started talking about it in a wider sense, I would be sitting down with those leaders and I'll be saying, hey, let me take you through this. This is what I'm trying to achieve. This is what I need to get there. Let's align that, because of course they've got their focuses, right?
Right.
And not every company is super great at sort of prioritizing what needs to be done to what result, right? And I think within that as well, I need to, incumbent in my responsibility is to be able to bring sufficient business case, right, from the ground up, as well as whatever the total addressable market opportunity is, to be able to change some of those priorities through discussion at the leadership suite. But basically, first and foremost, I need to go around, align that, perhaps change elements of it so it chimes in with others, but then really start to articulate it, right? And I would also, one of the things, again, I remember a second turnaround experience that I had where I was coming into a business unit that was isolated, dysfunctional. There were some people problems, but ultimately, performance wasn't where it should be either. Once you've identified who your pillars are that you're going to work through, in the words of my friend, once you've made yourself redundant because you're passing on some leadership responsibility to others, the second thing is to get those guys out of the nest, right? So when they start escalating to you, it's like, well, who have you spoken to? Who's in your network, right? Which is not to say you can't escalate at all, but it is to say, I'm asking you to change your behaviors a little bit, to go and creatively think about things and go and talk to others and then bring some options, right?
Right.
So when you start to break out your salespeople so that they are talking to the other functions as a matter of habit, right? And perhaps, even forming little groups to work on customer situations, that's where I think you can start to change some of those tensions, right?
Yep.
If you start going in and saying, hey, you're getting a salary because of us,
Right.
right? That's not winning hearts and minds, right? And it's not either. It may be true, but it's not aligning it to a mission either, right?
Right.
So this is where I think, communication, and then building those behaviors that create the culture. And even look, how many offsites have you been at, sales offsites, sales kickoffs, where there aren't other functions at the table?
Right.
Doesn't make any sense. And then how much clumping, as I would call it, do you see at company dues or company events where the same folks are sitting together and talking together all the time?
Right.
Got to split these folks up, but make it an exercise, right? So, you have somebody from each department and you're brainstorming whatever it is. What can we improve about our go-to-market? No bad ideas, you bring it up. Hope you will find some good ideas out of that. You make people responsible to make it happen, right?
Right.
But you do it through the function so that everyone feels a stake in it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know in your book you talk about, like go-to-market plans and things like that. And for me, the best companies that I was associated with and the things we did when we developed go-to-market plans, we had every functional area represented as input, right? Because they're gonna,
Mm,
if you just let sales and marketing do it, you're gonna miss. You're definitely gonna miss a lot of stuff. The back
correct.
end, and if you
Yeah.
you know if you just come up with it in a vacuum, it's gonna lead to people being pissed off that you didn't think about their function, and they're gonna have to jump through hoops to make something
Yeah.
happen that probably could have been avoided, right? Um,
Yeah. 100%.
yeah.
100% agree with you. Yeah.
So at what point, I know we'll talk about your book, and I know you write for CEO World Magazine, but at what point in your career to say, oh yeah, I want to be a writer, I'm going to write my first book, I'm going to write in
Yeah.
CEO World Magazine. What was the impetus
Yeah.
behind that, Rich?
uh, I can't admit to any great plan here. I think through the course of my career, and not in that first promotion setup, or probably not even in my second or third job, but certainly by my fourth job or so, um, I was getting in situations where I was getting, some of these startups I went in, I was basically the player before I was the player coach, before I was, building out a team. So I was often winning the initial customers, building those markets first. And then as you're hiring a team, I would be conscious of seeking to train or at least pass on some of the techniques that I've seen work. So I guess I've always had that sensibility of trying to coach and mentor others. Three things really triggered me to write this. One was someone in my network, quite senior, actually asked me how they should run a global sales team. And they emailed me and I didn't really know what to do with this. So I kind of picked up the phone. I was like, hey, what do you want? And they said, write it down. So, I wrote some basic principles down. But then I suppose two things really triggered me beyond that. And they all happened all around the same time, interestingly enough. But I was invited onto um, a call with a company based out here called New Campus, which is a kind of MBA leadership program for the leaders of tomorrow in Southeast Asia. And I was on this call with maybe 60 folks, all first-time managers, different industries. It was so diverse. So you've got every country you can think of in this space, Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore, Hong Kong, these are very culturally diverse environments, but also business culture that are different in each of these places. Different industries, every industry you can think of, from oil and gas through to banking. And one of the exercises was, what are your top three challenges, right? Everyone had to go away, think about these, come back, present. And they were all the same. So it just, and I was thinking back to mine, right? So it just struck me that there were, no more than six things that were all consistently the same, no matter what industry, no matter, you know, where you were in the world, what language you were speaking. And that led me to thinking back, as I said before, to the sort of three moments of my career. So, the promotion, the turnaround, where you're turning around an environment, and a new start, where, as I say, I've looked in the past for certain resources, and you can find individual elements of it, but I couldn't necessarily find something that put it all together, right? Um, and then just talking to people as you do, right, within your community, your network, and these subjects that keep coming up about not having a go-to-market plan, about, sort of lurching from one initiative to another, the sort of salespeople who shoot for everything kind of being praised because they're doing deals, but then 50% of these get cut because they're not profitable, all this kind of
Right.
stuff. And all of a sudden, I literally just found myself writing. It was a little bit like the alien chest burster.
Right.
It just all started coming out. And I was just getting into this routine of, before work, I was getting up and I was writing. And before I knew it, I had something like 50,000 words. So I sent this off to a ex-boss of mine and asked him to be brutal about it. And was there something here? He said there was. And then I learned how to do proposals to publishers, and lo and behold, I got a publisher. So that's
Yeah.
basically my story.
Yeah. I love it.
Um, so this thing has come out. I have another one coming out next year. I think I've got to the point where I love giving back. I want to give back, right? And I just sense that, as we've been talking about, none of these topics are unique in any environment, industry, or what have you, right?
Right.
Um, but these challenges are consistent.
Right.
So there is a better way, right?
Yeah.
And I guess the one thing that I do say consistently is you can't just lift this stuff out and use it like a template, right? It's there for you to bring your authentic self to. It's there for you to be conscious of your environment, your industry, the language of your industry,
Right.
and so forth, right? But that there is a better way if you can fuse your people to the mission, right?
Yeah. No, I love that. I,
That's what
I
I'm trying
I'm
to do.
so curious because I love culture. It's one of my favorite topics, and one of the things I'm always shocked that CEOs and C-suite don't want their company to be the best company to work for, type thing. Why
Mm,
wouldn't you aspire to that? But
yeah.
talk about, can you have in your opinion, can you have a shitty corporate culture yet a great sales organization culture? Is that possible?
I think you can have one that produces results, but it's not necessarily a happy environment to work in. I've witnessed, and I certainly know many people who live in that type of environment where perhaps a culture is stated, but it's not lived,
Right.
right? Now, we're in that kind of evolution of business, and that any company that is seeking to become an IPO'd company, it's a tick in the box for some, right? You've got to put the culture down. You've got to put the values. It's got to be on the website, right?
Right.
But the truth is it lived through the organization, right?
Right.
And some of the environments where that can be extra difficult are founder cultures, right? Where,
Mhm.
generally speaking, founders, I mean, you can paint some broad brushes here, but they tend to be, uh, hyper ambitious, very focused, but not necessarily from functions such as sales, right? So, or they may be very charismatic and very good at doing deals, but again, they might not be structured in other ways, right?
Yeah.
And they might also bleed into that, a certain type of selling is the only way to do it, and so
Yeah.
on and so forth. So, yeah, absolutely. You can have companies who can still scale, absolutely, who can still sell, but
Mhm.
maybe not efficiently, right?
Right.
Or maybe, as I say, I think what I've seen in a lot of these environments is that kind of shotgun approach,
Yeah.
where people are literally shooting for everything because no one has taken the time, and I'm afraid to say it is the commercial leaders' responsibility to do this, to define what are the winning use cases,
Right.
right? And declutter and narrow that aperture to actually do more damage in the market,
Yeah.
right? Because it just causes so many problems. If you're pulling in all manner of deals and you're cutting half of them because you can't scale them or they're not profitable, what are you doing? You're going to lurch along the,
Right.
the pathway, towards your destination. You're probably going to be again fighting your battles in the trenches, as opposed to being able to lift your
Yeah.
head.
Yeah, no, I love your book in terms of, how behaviors, determine actions, and actions determine the culture, and culture determines the results, and hopefully they're transformational.
Yeah.
And I haven't read the chapter on CRM and pipeline management, but since I have starting with contact management systems like Act and Goldmine, I implemented Siebel at
Yeah.
Bayer Crop Science, the agricultural division. I've, Salesforce. I've been involved in
Yes.
implementation, and I've worked with HubSpot. But I'd love your thoughts
Yeah.
on just CRM in general, in terms of where it's come, and it just seems to be a lot of the same, disenchantment from the sales teams with it. So I love your
No,
thoughts there.
absolutely. Look, I think, you know, again, I look at it through the lens of commercial leader. You've got to when you come into an environment, or if you're in an environment and you're seeking to improve it, or you're seeking to hit your numbers full stop, you have to diagnose where it is you've got to focus, right? Where it is you've got to prioritize. You've got to have your investments. You need to know what's true to win. If you're at all disengaged from that and you're simply asking, what's your commitment? What's your commitment? You're not going to have a fluid growing business, I would suggest,
Right.
right? And one of the fundamentals of that is your data, right? So, and look, again, this is universal. You've explained it. I've seen it time and time again. You come into environments and you can't see any, you can't have faith in the numbers that are being presented to you, right? So I think one of those things, first and foremost, is that you do go to your CRM and you do pull some reporting out of it and you do see what it's telling you,
Right.
because it will tell you, it will give you a lot of information, right? You'll know what your trajectory is. You'll know from your funnel where, what's happening. If you've got a lot of stuff stuck, at a mature stages not closing, have you got a conversion problem? Have you got nothing coming in the pipe? Are you boom and bust, right?
Right.
you know it's going to tell you that stuff immediately, which is already going to help you have a sense about where you need to focus. But then, if you're in a mature organization, you have to, well, any organization, I would say, you have to be able to report your numbers with some sense of authority, right?
Right.
And equally, when it goes around planning your year and what have you, you've got to be able to, with sense, to know what are your primary targets, that if you put them down fast, you're going to have an easier pathway to your year. Because again, you're always going to have to pivot at some point, most likely, right?
Right.
And if your CRM is full of rubbish, you know, so I think a lot of that is, again, is kind of cultural, because it's behaviors. You've got to say to, you've got to give your team and those teams that rely on this data that sensibility that it's actually there to help them as much as it is to help the leaders, right? How are they structuring their business if they've got a load of garbage in there, right?
Right.
And I think there's an element of carrot and stick in this, because if it's not in the CRM, I ain't going to pay you a commission on it. If it's not progressing and I can't see touch points, again, it's
Right.
you've got to instill these behaviors.
Yeah.
I think like it or not, this is the admin side of the business, right?
Yeah.
And people have to do their due diligence
Yeah.
around it. But I think a lot of that is also that you're conferring on them, the responsibility to be creative about their businesses. I like to think of salespeople as running their own little businesses within the business.
Sure.
And again, I think of the analogy of a car engine, right? You've got big components in there, small components, but they're all equally important. And if they're not working in harmony and smoothly, you know, it's going to break down, or you're going to lurch your way to your destination, right? And you want to smooth a journey as you possibly can. And if you put your CRM as the kind of fuel, or the oil in that, was the oil really, right?
Right.
In there, good oil helps an engine work well, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's mind-boggling to me how often that is one of the first things you have to look at and fix.
Right.
And I'm sure you recognize that as well, right?
Yeah. The internal challenge, but it's all
Yeah,
good. Rich,
yeah,
you mentioned a second book. Tell us
yeah.
about that. You said it's coming out next year.
Yeah, um, so I've been a lifelong salesperson, as we've talked about. I, like many, I think, came from something of an introvert personality, but over time, I find, from my journey from there to now, I get an enormous pleasure interacting with people and networking and things like this. Um, so two things really. So I was on a podcast not so long ago, which was basically framing career changes, right? And the career change in that sense was, becoming a writer, I suppose. And we were talking about the premise of the book. And I was asked the question, how would you support or encourage people who are not confident with self-promotion, right? Or who have a negative sensibility of sales, but it could help them in their careers.
Right.
So I was thinking about that because I think, we kind of talked right at the very beginning about some of the negative stereotypes of sales, boiler rooms and, aggressive sales environment, always be closing type of places, right? And we see them a lot in our media on movies and what have you, right? Glengarry, Glen Ross
Yeah.
and things like this, the
Put
classic.
that coffee down.
Yeah, exactly. You haven't earned it. Right. Um, and then I was, inevitably, having written a book, you've got to promote it. So you're on LinkedIn a lot. And I was just looking at some of the posts. Some of the most interacted with posts are around the kind of broken candidate experience people are having when they're trying to find jobs, right? I've seen very typical ones where, I applied to 100 roles, I got 2 callbacks, I didn't get either job, frustration basically. Um, and these things are interacted with like you wouldn't believe, like 20,000 posts. We talked about Paul Hatch, 400,000 interactions on an article about essentially ageism, right?
Right.
And the difficulties of experienced people getting into the workforce, perhaps taking a smaller role, that sense that you can't keep rising, that kind of thing, right?
Right.
And I have been, in the course of my career, I've essentially created the job that then got advertised that I was shortlisted against, which became a public advert 4 times, right? Knowing full well I have better access to the hiring panel. I know those problems that they're facing better. I can articulate my ROI better than anyone coming into that process, right? Because I have
Right.
such an inside track, because I've created it.
Right.
And so I've written a book which is basically about networking, but it's about how you approach what I call the connected job market. Because, the 6 degrees of separation, you're no more than 2 or 3 conversations essentially away from what could be your next job,
Right.
right? And that can happen at any stage of your career, at any age. And, I was talking to a recruiter the other day, only about 25% of LinkedIn posted job adverts are genuinely open,
Wow.
right?
I've never
The
heard that stat
recruitment
before, but I,
industry,
I believe it.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
the recruitment industry is changed fundamentally with the internet. So, unless it's a headhunter or a confidential hire type of recruiter, you are not going to meet a recruiter. They are not going to talk to you because it's sourcing centers that are driving the flow of CVs, because the recruiter is actually managing the client, because the client is often trying to get the candidate directly themselves. So the ownership of the client is the battle they're fighting. They're
Right.
not meeting you or I to screen you. That's being done by a screening center based upon keyword searches that are happening on LinkedIn, where again, you're not likely to talk to these people. So again, what I'm trying to articulate is this is a very challenging environment. You've got to kind of know the challenges to make the case for why you should do things differently. But I'm also trying to encourage people who are either familiar with it or not familiar or nervous about it to be able to network, and how to do that in a non-threatening way, and also to come to terms with, you have to sell yourself, you have to promote yourself, right? And that's not boasting, that's not, it's not, it's not a bad thing to do. You need, whether you're going for an HR role or a marketing role or a sales role, to be able to articulate what your return on investment is, what your process is, why you're
Right.
different than somebody else. And, again, just the final piece on this, having hired a lot of people in my career, I'm always staggered at the level, or should I say, the lack of research that candidates do coming into an interview, which should be a two-way conversation, right?
Sure.
And then you've basically got the CV, you've got the candidate, and you're like, I want to meet the person on paper. Who are you? Right? Because they've not come with any sensibility of who you are, what your business is, which is, whether I've posted anything or talked about leadership or whatever it might be, They need to be coming to drive that conversation. So I also talk about how when you do get into a conversation, you can take control of it essentially.
Yeah. No, I love that. Yeah, I'm very empathetic to job seekers, and I totally agree. I got a LinkedIn post, somebody not in my first connections, because it had so much play, because, they applied to 60 jobs, and,
Mm,
I actually went to the person's background, looked like the person was in their early 30s,
right,
great, got laid off by United Healthcare here, and
right.
it was just, and actually a very I don't know if it was United Healthcare HR person, but it would somebody actually made a really nice post, a reply to talk about what you can do. But you're right. I mean it's keywords. That if you don't match the keywords in the job description in your resume, you're going to get rejected automatically. It used to be
Yeah,
they would if you press submit, you would get a rejection letter immediately. Now they've softened
right.
that. You're going to get rejected because you don't have enough keywords in your resume to match, but they space it out a little bit, so it's not like it's, oh my God, I just pressed submit, because that has
Yeah,
happened to me when those ATSs were just out, and
yeah.
I,
Well, those are
it,
horrible anyway, because the amount, I mean, the world-class organizations that again speak about culture, that demand, you upload your CV, but they demand that you then re-enter it
oh
manually.
God,
And then if you ever apply to them again, there's no memory of you.
right,
That to me is just diabolical, right? And
yeah,
because that is, that's a customer facing
yeah,
portal at the end of the day,
right,
right? And it's not built for the candidate. But
yeah,
you mentioned something else there, redundancy. I can't tell you how many, I mean, we see it more and more these days, right? And I think increasingly you're going to, obviously, COVID had a huge impact on businesses, people suddenly finding themselves redundant and then suddenly thinking to turn to the resource that can help them the most, which is their network. And they've not been thinking about their network, right?
right,
They've not developed it. So
yeah,
again, I'm just trying to encourage people that no matter what you're doing, you're in a job, you're stable, or you're thinking of your a promotion or whatever it might be, or you're redundant, you must be a good servant to your network consistently,
yes,
right?
yes,
Because you can't just turn to it when you need something. I mean, obviously you have to sometimes,
yeah.
but if you're instilling those conversations and you're giving something back to it, that's where you're more likely to have job security, whether you need it or not.
Right.
Is I think a key point here.
Rich, I love helping two groups of people. One's that recent university graduate, so they're going to get their first post-university job.
Yeah,
And it's a daunting process, as we just talked about, but especially for a recent, graduate, because they don't have a professional career. Maybe they had an internship or whatever. But what advice would you have for them as they navigate their first job search as well as they start their career?
yeah. I think well, the first thing, I've been very impressed by some interns that I've seen recently come through our company, and I think one of the greatest attributes you can have is curiosity, right? Be curious, ask questions, right? And seek people out who can maybe help you on your journey, of course, but that's not something you can directly ask for, but who are going to give you guidance, right? And I think, something I tell my kids actually, and we LinkedIn we talked about in a negative sense, right a minute ago, right, in terms of that candidate experience, but it's also a very powerful tool. And there's no one that you can't reach out to and ask questions of, as long as you're passionate, compelling, succinct, right? Bullet points, not essays.
Right.
And as long as you've got a bit of EQ about it and you're not outstaying your welcome, you can have a conversation with anyone. I had an intern at a company a couple of years back who was very keen on a sports career. I happened to be in a startup that was based around some football IP, and I encouraged this person to reach out to someone very senior in Manchester City Football Club who happened to be based in Singapore. And I told him how to do it. And I said, just be fearless, just put it out there. If you don't hear anything, you know, so what? He sends it out, he gets an immediate response and gets invited for a coffee. And the guy basically gave the benefit of his advice and career. So that's the first thing. Those are the two things. Be curious, learn how to put a compelling proposition across, right? Which can be your passion to go towards a direction or to learn something, right?
Yeah.
And again, just do your research, because not everyone, again, I think of the differential between myself and my kids. I didn't really have a direction when I entered, the workforce. I found a very happy home in payments, which is now FinTech, and a environment that I really both thrived but am passionate about. Not everyone has the benefit of knowing what it is they want to do, right?
Right.
With some sense of certainty.
Yeah.
So if that's the
probably
case,
99.999% of the
probably, right?
graduates.
Yeah. You've got to do your research. And I think you've also got to reflect. I was guilty of not reflecting a lot or not listening to myself when I was young, my instincts or what have you. And, you might intern somewhere and not have a good relationship. But that's a learning experience. If you're not pulling, just reflecting on, well, what did I go through? What did I like, not like? What was wrong? What did I perceive to be wrong? Were there people that I spoke to who were different, and why? You've got to absorb that information, which is, again, I suppose, coming back to curiosity.
Yeah.
So I would say those things.
Yeah, no, all of that is great. I really like the one about reaching out on LinkedIn or somehow via email, because what I tell recent college graduates, because I mentor a few of them over the years, been doing it since like 2012, is that people always remember, no matter how old they are, how bad it was to get a job out of college. It just is a daunting, anxiety-ridden experience, and people have empathy for those starting that process. So, they'll give you time and advice, and now you have a connection to build a relationship with. So I love that. So the second group, and we've kind of talked about this, but that second group is when you go from an individual contributor and take the career path where you're actually going to be responsible for a group of people on an org chart. What advice would you have for them as they begin that leadership journey?
The first thing is not to be so conscious of what it is you don't know, right? And to root yourself in what it is that you do know. If you don't have a sensibility of your values, and perhaps it's not likely you'll have a philosophy straight out the gate, but if you don't have a sense of your values, I would interrogate yourself to have a sense of that as well. And then, don't be in such a rush, just like I was. You feel the pressure, you gotta perform, right? Take some time to understand what is happening in your business, right? Be the detective. Go out, gather those resources, and have some sense about where it is that you can focus to make a real difference. Because if you don't do that, you won't change anything. You'll go financial year to financial year, it'll be just the same as the person before. You'll just bring a little more energy to it, and whatever your core competencies are, right? For good or bad.
Right.
So I think, and listen to yourself. If you're not listening to yourself as an important data input, as your CRM, right, then you're missing something as well. Right. Because you might be feeling a lot of emotions. Some of those might be negative, and you should really interrogate those. Right. If you're feeling imposter syndrome, why is it? And how's that holding you back? And I would spend time in a structured way to not ignore those things and brush them under the carpet, which I think is, what a lot of people do in getting busy. But, ask yourself, what is the leadership shift I want to make, right? Because that's going to improve your leadership, improve your journey.
Yeah.
So those three things. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Rich, you've been great. It's after midnight, your time in Singapore. So I really appreciate you coming on the Corporate Couch today. I loved our conversation.
Yeah, so much, Jeff. Thank you so much. It's been an honor. And this time has flown, to be honest with you. It's been great fun.
Yes. What a great conversation with Rich. I just loved many firsts. He was first guest that lives internationally, lives in Singapore for the last 12 years. We were recording at 11 p.m. his time and went to after midnight. What a trooper.
Yeah.
I think it was 17-hour difference or something like that. I can't remember.
Literally the other side of the world.
First FinTech person. A hell of a great accent. I mean, just
Isn't that
British.
wonderful?
Oh man, wanted to be James Bond as a kid. I mean, that's cool. There were so many things. I mean, he wrote a book about the cultural sales leader, how they build great cultures, and it's about people, vision, values, and talked about boiler room. I get boiler room references and about cold calling, and again cultures and how. And I see this a lot, and I talk to a lot of people about this when newly appointed managers that have never managed anyone or led a team before, they get promoted, and whether that's a sales account person gets promoted to sales manager, or a marketing brand manager now runs a team of marketing associates, they don't get trained. It's like, oh yeah, you can figure it out. It's like, hey, I'm a good athlete. I've never played golf before. How hard can it be? Well, from experience, I'll tell you, it's freaking hard.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened to me. I was in IT. They all of a sudden made me a boss, and they said, go out and lead these people, and I didn't even know what lead these people meant.
He's got a second book coming out here sometime. We're recording in January 2025. I think it's coming out in a few months, but it's all about kind of why you should network, why you should promote yourself. And he had this stat, which I found astonishing, that 25% of jobs you see on LinkedIn are actually open, meaning the other 75% are really filled and they're just putting it out there. I'm like, I did not fact check that, but I'm like, wow.
But I would not be surprised.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised either. I just was shocked at the percentage. But Joe, what'd you take out the conversation with Rich?
That's what you get when you build a platform and you literally let anybody post anything they want. Yeah, I'm not surprised at all about that. You guys did a little section on CRMs, customer relationship management tools. And one of the points that you wanted to make was you had personally overseen the installation of several of these products. One of them that you mentioned was ACT. And I actually had to look that up again. I thought, I remember ACT. Was ACT
ACT and Gold Mine.
And it's still a thing. It's still a thing. And I thought, wow, that's interesting, because I remember that from almost 30 years ago that it was out there.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you talked about is how they're really the same thing. And still the problem that you have is the input of good data, that you're just begging your salesman or your sales force to input the good data. And that was something that you and I fought battles almost all the time when we were working together in different industries of, please, Mr. Salesman, when you make a call, when you're sitting in your car in the parking lot, open up your CRM tool and type in the results of that call. Type in some notes, type in the number of employees, type in what you learned, type in the name of the receptionist, type in, just give us something, give us some data to work with. No matter how much CRMs mature through the years, you're still going to have to fight that battle of having good data input into them. I thought it was a very fascinating and enjoyable interview.
Yeah, I mean, you and I at Behringer created a series of videos in a fun way to make it where they would listen to us versus sending emails out. And we did a take on the PC Mac commercials of the 2010-ish time period, that you kind of look like the PC guy in the commercial, and I, by default, look more like the younger Mac guy.
You look more like Steve Jobs.
There you go.
And it's like you can only send out so many emails that says to the salesman, please type in your data. So you got to do something to make them fun, make it interesting, make it enjoyable.
Exactly. Joe, any final thoughts on the conversation with Rich?
Yeah, Jeff, do you know when is the best time to make a dentist appointment?
I have no clue, Joe.
At 2:30.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Corporate Couch. If you enjoy the podcast, I would love for you to take 2 minutes out of your day to rate us 5 stars and write a review. Please join me next week to learn from another great leader sharing their professional journey and insights.